Good morning, everyone. Thank you and welcome to our second installment of Women in the Bible Study. Today, we are going to be looking at Deborah in the book of Judges, chapters 4 and 5. I honestly didn't know much about Deborah. Really, I found her because of this beautiful artwork by Wright Pittman, by one of my favorite artists, a collection of women called a Sanctified art. And I saw this painting and I said, well, let's see what Deborah has for us. So we've got a really, really fun story today. To set kind of the story and the background just a little bit, in the Bible, we work our way through the book of Genesis. Then we see the book of Exodus, where the Israelites are liberated from slavery, and they spend 40 years in the desert trying to get to the promised land. Fast forward, and we get to the book of Joshua, who finally successfully brings the people into the promised land of Canaan. The problem is people are already there. So this is happening in relatively 1125 BCE. And the Israelites as a nation are battling the Canaanites. When we get into the book of Judges, they are experiencing oppression from the Canaanites, which is leading the people to worship false idols. Their towns and communities are attacked by the Canaanites, and ultimately they are turning to the judges of the time to help them. So in the book of Judges, this is a collection of stories from the leaders during the early days during these battles with Canaanites. So again, Israelites are facing some extreme oppression, and they turn to the different judges who are the leaders at the time. This is before Israel had kings. One important note about the book of Judges, there is some scholarship that thinks there is a lot of fabrication in some of these stories. The judges are seen as these wild and crazy superheroes who gain their power from God. And if you read the different ways that the judges are at work, they are pretty awesome. So when the book of Judges was finally written, about 800 years later than when these accounts happened, it was when the Israelites were in exile in Babylon, which was a really, really dark time for the people. And so there is scholarship that thinks that the book of Judges came out as a way of giving hope to the people and showing them, look at what we did in the past, and here's what we can do now. We can do this again. That being said, the book of Judges is a lot more fun to read than I previously thought. So go in head first and enjoy the stories that are in it because it's really, really interesting. So that being said, there is a cycle of the Israelites that we see over and over and over and over and over again. And truth be told, it's a cycle that we all sometimes can fall into ourselves. We've seen it in the book of Exodus, we see it in the book of Judges, we've seen it all over. So what happens? The Israelites turn away from God. They are conquered or oppressed or in need, or, they're not doing well. Then they cry out to God and say, well, how could you abandon us? We need help. God then delivers the people, often through a person, whether it is Moses, whether it's one of the judges. And then the people rejoice and say, great, God is great, all is good. And then eventually they start turning away from God again. So this happens over and over again. And it is exactly where we find the Israelites in our story today. They are turned away from God because they're getting oppressed by the Canaanites. They turn and they cry out to Deborah, who is the judge at the time, and they say, we need help, we need to be delivered. Where is God in all of this? God works through Deborah and Jael, and we see that they are delivered, and then they rejoice. So our story today is really, really one of beauty. And that's mostly because this deliverance is carried out by two women. So our focus is going to be on Deborah, but we will talk about the awesome woman, Jael, as well. So going through the story, if you haven't already read it, this will be a little bit of an overview. And if you have read it, hopefully this will be some review. So the Israelites are oppressed. They turn to Deborah for counsel and guidance, part of that cycle I just talked about. Deborah turns to God and speaks with God about what to do. God tells her to enlist the help of Barak and to take on the Canaanites. So in this section of the chapter, there's some really good verses I want to point out. In verse 6, Deborah says, the Lord commands you to Barak. And this short little phrase confirms Deborah's role as God's prophet, but also as a servant doing the work of God. It's a really powerful little phrase coming from a woman, that is. So she consults Barak and enlists his help because he is one of Israelites' most capable military men brought in for his guidance and leadership in this battle. 2 verses later in verse 8, Barak says to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Now, this is a really unusual phrase for a man to say to a woman. But in saying it, Barak is showing his confidence in Deborah's abilities. He's saying, if you'll go with me, then great, we can do this together. Deborah's response demonstrates her leadership and her willingness to lead from the front, which is also really awesome to see a woman not only in power in consultation, but also in power in the sense of she's out there doing this. Barak could have said, great, thanks for telling me, see you later. But instead, he says, if you go with me, we could do this. So continuing on the story, as they are getting ready for the battle, Deborah warns Barak that they will be successful because of God. And so he is to not take any of the victory for himself. But she also says, a woman will deliver Sisera. Sisera is the head of the Canaanite army. So that's a really big kind of foreshadowing thrown in there that Deborah does. So the battle ensues. The Israelites defeat the Canaanite army, and Sisera escapes. One really interesting point in the story, it talks about this awful rainstorm that came at the Canaanite army, giving the Israelites the advantage. And there is historical evidence in other historical texts that say that this storm really happened, which is really kind of a cool thing to think about. So Sisera, in escaping, he goes to the tribe of Heber camp, which is not too far away from where this battle is happening. And the tribe of Heber, they would have been on the side of the Canaanites. And so in going there, Sisera is seeking safety. Enter our awesome woman, Jael. That's how I say it. I have no idea how it's really pronounced. Whatever you think is acceptable, just go with it. So Jael sees Sisera and welcomes him into her home. She gives him something to drink, she gives him food, and she gives him rest, following all of the custom hospitality code at the time. However, she breaks the code by taking a tent peg and putting it through his skull, which is a really brutal murder. But she was resourceful and used what she had. She knew that Sisera was bad. She knew that Sisera was no good. There are some scholars who think there may have been some forced sexual action from Sisera towards Jael. So whatever her motives for killing him, she followed them, and she's pretty awesome. So chapter 4 ends, the Israelites liberate themselves, they celebrate, they return back to their belief in God, and they get to experience some calm and some peace. Judges chapter 5 is the poetic retelling of chapter 4. So if you were reading it and thinking, didn't I just read this? You are correct. They are almost the same story. But what chapter 5 gives us is it gives us a glimpse of how stories were told in ancient times. And in this story of Deborah's victory is potentially one of the oldest Hebrew songs of victory ever recorded, which is really awesome because she's a woman. These judges, again, were seen as superheroes, which means that their songs may have been a little embellished and fabricated, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about not positive about what all is true and what all might have been made up to give people hope. But regardless, we know this is an awesome story of an amazing woman, two amazing women who help Israel ultimately experience 40 years of peace. Which for Deborah is a really big accomplishment, that she was the judge at the time who brought them such a long period of peace. So a little bit of background information on Deborah. Of the 15 judges who led Israel in the 200 years of judges, Deborah was the first and only female judge. She was the only woman placed at this height of political power by the people. And I would argue that few women have ever reached this height of power, even in 2020. Some people compare her actions to those similar of Joan of Arc, in that she was a powerhouse. And we see women in lots of powerful positions, but I don't necessarily feel like we see them in such a role of counselor and military at the same time. And I would also argue that very few women today are liberating an entire peoples successfully. They are trying, but they are facing trouble. So who are the judges? Their political duties include dealing with judgment and justice for the people. They are a judge for their disputes. They are a counselor to their questions and their times of need. And they are ultimately deliverers in times of war, and they are warriors. So when you hear this term judge, of Deborah being a judge, it is more than just a gavel. It is a really powerful, all-encompassing leader of the community. People trusted Deborah because of her intelligence, her diplomacy, her faith, and her foresight. Words. So to the fact that she was so trusted by the community is why she was successful and as a faithful servant of God. She is also called a prophet. She spoke with God on behalf of the people. And even in a patriarchal society, it was not uncommon for women to be prophets. If God spoke to anyone, they were respected for that, regardless of gender, which I think is a really awesome and powerful example so early in our history of women being treated as equals when they have a strong faith. Deborah was a fierce warrior leading an army of thousands. Not only is she the first female warrior in the Bible, but not once did she display fear which inspired and ignited the people to action. She was an awesome leader. And she goes with Barak to the front lines of the battle without question. And all of this is rooted in the fact that she is a faithful servant of God. Her faith in God became the strength of Israel, and she became the keeper of a new spiritual vision that would light all of Israel. Her faith elevated her in status and helped inspire faith in others. She counseled diligently in times of peace, but was also there counseling in times of war. And as we see in chapter 5, Deborah takes no credit for herself, none. She gives all the glory to God who brought them to victory. So I think that all of this combined, Deborah is a really wonderful example of true leadership, what it means to be rooted in God and to have faith in God. And she's really, truly humble that she doesn't take any credit for herself. Now, our second awesome woman, who I honestly had no idea about. I read through the story for not the first time in my life, but my first time critically analyzing it. And I said, who is this amazing second woman that we have in the story? Again, I will call her Jael. Feel free to let me know how you think it's pronounced. And as with any word in the Bible that we're not sure how it's pronounced, just go with your thought. So a little bit of background information about Jael. She is from the tribe of Heber. They were traveling metalsmiths, and they sympathized with and helped the Canaanite army. So if they were in fact metal workers, they potentially outfitted the Canaanite army for battle. That's really important because that means that when Sisera entered the camp, he never in his wildest dreams expected to meet his death. He thought that he was going into people who liked the Canaanite army. And so something important about her, she violated these ancient codes of hospitality, which were the fundamental norms at the time. And there are three major points in this. One, men were supposed to do the offering of hospitality and the welcoming of people in, and women were just supposed to do everything else. So in proper terms, Jael's husband should have welcomed Sisera, but we never see him. So Sisera welcomes him, or not Sisera, Jael welcomes Sisera into her home. And in this action, you can see that there is some kind of relationship between the Canaanites and this tribe of Heber. And so, second point, in killing him, Jael is violating this covenant between these two groups of people. And in number 3, in killing him, Jael totally violates the fundamental rights of a guest. Hospitality towards strangers is one of the most important social values at the time. We see it in the story of Jesus and throughout the entire Bible about how strangers are welcomed and food is given. And so for Jael to break these norms would be a really big deal that could ultimately threaten her life down the road. Now, what is important is that her actions were justified, even though she broke this code, mostly because there were no just and wise laws at the time. So she quite literally got away with murder, which is all really interesting to look at the ways that customs and rules and laws and norms influence and play together. Jael's actions are told in a very poetic manner in Judges 5, which again leads me to think that it would be a really cool comparison to look at the ways chapter 5 is fabricated and sung as opposed to what we hear in chapter 4. So all of that being said, Jael is a complete and utter awesome woman. And you can include whatever awesome term you want to use to describe her. because at the end of the day, she is the one who delivers Sisera to the Israelite people and to Barak, to show that the battle has ended, and the Israelites won. So, bless the women who are often glanced over, such as this wonderful woman. So, a little bit about interpreting women in the book of Judges. They didn't until the 1970s, which is relatively recent. Some biblical feminist scholarship finally decided in the 1970s to tackle the book of Judges for its portrayal of women. And in doing so, they examined the interplay of gender, sexuality, masculinity, and ethno-religious discourse on the actions of the people and the ways that they interact. In this, we see, especially in this story, the reversal of traditional gender roles. So Deborah is, in fact, the leader of the Israelite people. She is not a traditional woman in the home, cooking dinner and cleaning and caring for the children. She is leading all of the children of Israel, which is really awesome. In the book of Judges, we see women portrayed as all different kinds of people. They are portrayed as leaders, seductive killers, mothers, wise women, and spoils of war. So not everyone in the book is as revered as Deborah, but the fact that we have all of these stories told in one way or another is also really important. And for our two women in Judges 4 and 5, what's important is that they are remembered for their public success as opposed to their womanly duties. Deborah is remembered for her public success in war and her liberation of the Israelites and the experience of peace for 40 years. Jael is remembered for her seductive murder of Sisera. Neither of these women are known for having a good pie or a clean house, which is just really wonderful. I love getting to see the different ways women are portrayed and how their stories can continue to be uplifting and liberating for women everywhere. So a few lessons from Deborah. She is a woman of faith that led her people to victory and spiritual healing. I think that she's a great example for the ways that women are needed and are important in society and in the church, and in the guidance of people everywhere. Deborah also tells us that we can find God's voice even in the middle of a battle. She also teaches us that leadership sometimes means leading from the front lines, and sometimes it means listening. We see her do both in just these 2 chapters, but we know that she was the judge for longer, both before and after the war. So there was lots of times for listening and lots of times for leading on the front lines. And lastly, Deborah teaches us that we can trust in God even when it feels impossible. And there are so many other lessons. I invite you to please share your thoughts with me, lessons from Deborah, lessons from Jael, and what you think. Lastly, I said it last week, I don't love putting this many words on the slide, but I just love this quote from Wright Pittman, the artist who did this picture of Deborah. And the first part is really what's the most important, in my opinion. And she says, amid the oppression of her people, Deborah creates space for channeling God's wisdom. In the chaos of war, she finds stillness under a palm tree and tunes herself to God's voice. This is really powerful for me, and I think for all of us right now during this time of COVID-19, that we might not be in the chaos of war, but we're in the chaos of life and just existing. And if we can follow Deborah's example of stillness and tuning to God, maybe we'll be able to channel wisdom and strength to continue on this journey together through life. That is all I have for Deborah. I hope that you enjoyed this discussion video. You can join us for a discussion on Monday at 7 p.m. The date is May 25th. And if you have questions or comments or concerns, please feel free to email me. I love hearing your feedback, and I'm enjoying doing this project. So I look forward to seeing you guys on Monday and doing another video soon. Take care and remember the strength and power of Deborah. Amen.